Pan-Africanism has for so long been regarded as the best drive for Africa's development, and it is in this regard, right here in RBA studios, we're gladly joined by Ahmed Bening, the Secretary General of the Pan-African Union. Sir, we're glad to have you this evening in our studios.
Thank you.
How does Pan-African Union support the youth? Starting from this.
So, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on your show. If you know, the Pan-African Youth Union is the coordinating institution for national youth councils. That means that fundamentally we coordinate the activities of national youth councils and the implementation of the Africa Youth Charter. The Africa Youth Charter is the continental blueprint or continental policy that guides youth mainstreaming on the continent. Right. So every country is supposed to domesticate that into a national youth policy that's supposed to guide the development process. So for us, we effectively coordinate that and its implementation.
Right. And of course, talking about leadership and the youth, how do we create space for these youth, especially in Africa, for those who are politically, who want to be politically inclusive? How do we give them space, or how do we create space for them?
I think that it's not about creating space for young people. It's about young people themselves recognizing their strength, their potential. On the African continent, 70% of the overall population is made up of young people below 35 years. That means that for every country, young people have got what it takes to determine the political status quo.
All right.
The question should be, do we recognize that potential as young people? And are we taking advantage of our numbers to direct the development trajectory of our countries or the continent? That should be the continent. That should be actually our preoccupation as young people.
All right.
In terms of spaces, I believe that once the advocacy is led by young people, every government, every country would recognize that potency and would follow suit.
And absolutely, you just mentioned about the numbers. As we talk right now, Africa has the youngest population in the world, with more than 400 million young people aged between 15 to 35. And of course, with the Agenda 2063 in mind, what role can they play in the flagship programs of this Agenda 2063?
Often I have said that as young people, we cannot wait to be given an opportunity to be involved in the development processes of this continent or in our respective countries. The Agenda 2063 is a 50-year blueprint. Those leading the continent now may not be alive in 50 years. That means that as young people, we have a responsibility of taking the development of this continent as a responsibility. Right. Now, that means that as young people, if we want to create an integrated, prosperous, and secured continent, right, our role should be taking leadership roles in agriculture, in IT, in entrepreneurship, ensuring that our governments do not mortgage the natural resources of this continent to the Chinese, to the Europeans, and to the Americans, but ensuring that they scale up policy that will ensure that all the natural resources that we have on this continent is appropriated to our collective benefit. All right. That means that we must start by taking advantage over the manufacturing and processing sectors of this continent. Right. I have always raised this issue about land policy on the continent, because the next big thing on this continent is agriculture. And if we are supposed to take advantage of the agribusiness on this continent, the arable land on this continent, we need to sit with our governments. We need to start that advocacy of ensuring that governments actually put in place the appropriate land policy and land tenure system so young people can access the land, so they can use it. The gold, the coffee, the cocoa, the diamonds. We as young people must begin to bring our sense of ingenuity on how to transform these into finished products, either than mortgaging and signing off concessions to companies that are non-African and they move their raw material outside the continent. So I believe that if we are talking about really accomplishing the objectives of Agenda 2063, we as young people must rise to the occasion. We must hold our governments across the continent to make sure that the resources of this continent is used judiciously, and that includes how conscientized we are as young people.
All right.
And I believe that once we proceed on this trajectory, this continent will be prosperous.
Absolutely, sir. But we're talking about what needs to be done by the African youth, but where do we still lag behind? Where is the gap?
I think that the fundamentally, the gap is the kind of mentality that we have. If you meet 100 young people on the streets of Kigali or the streets of Lagos or Accra, they believe that progress and success is in Europe and in America. They don't recognize the real value of the wealth that we have on the African continent. Reality is that in the Europe and the Americas, for them to live the kind of life that they have right now, they need to depend on the natural resources of this continent. So the way to move this continent is to ensure that we sit back in this continent, ensure that we bring our sense of ingenuity to harness the productive resources of this continent. And I just said, the productive resources of this continent, the land is one, the mineral resources, the mineral wealth of this continent is another. So young people should not necessarily focus attention on just politics. Because when we talk about leadership and development, young people assume that you must be the president of a country or you must be a member of parliament to be in charge.
All right.
You can be a leader in agriculture, you can be a leader in IT, you can be a leader in entrepreneurship.
All right.
That is the way we harness the potential of the continent. That is the way to achieve the aspirations of Agenda 2063.
And so as you're talking about this, about the opportunities the youth have to explore, the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements, among others, have been signed and is now into action. But how best should the youth deal with the challenges available, of course, in exploring the opportunities available for the African continent?
So the bigger challenge of Africa Continental Free Trade really is not about the document that's been signed. It's about the commitment of our governments to operationalizing that. You don't sign an Africa Free Trade whilst other countries are signing new deals with the UK, while countries are signing the Economic Partnership Agreement with Europe. Because really, the potential that the CFTA presents to this continent is the 1.2 billion people on this continent. That is a huge market. That is the market China wants to break into. That is the market Europe wants to break into. So what are African companies doing trying to break into the European market when you have 1.2 billion people on the continent?
All right.
That's what young people must focus attention on. The issue of visas. You don't sign a continental free trade agreement, rectify it, and you start the operationalization. And a businessman from Rwanda would require a visa to go to Nigeria. A businessman in Nigeria would require a visa to go to South Africa. These are the things that we need to begin to break down if we actually want to take advantage of the enormous potential that the CFTA presents. And so that brings the young people and the governments to the table again to say, young startups, our interest is not Europe, China, and the Americas. Right. Our interest is the 1.2 billion people on the African continent. Absolutely. Because if you look at our trade between Africa and Europe or China, our exports, we import more than we export. Now that means that the consumer base of the African continent requires a lot more than we produce. The manufacturing sector of the African continent is centered in just 5 countries.
All right.
South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco. The rest of the countries, what are we doing? So we need to take advantage of the scale of the CFTA so that we can build businesses that are resilient and then can meet the needs of the African continent.
Absolutely. And so finally, in your opinion, is Africa's future safe and is it in good hands? Of course, in regards to the challenges available, for instance, you just talked about a big number of African youth who run to other continents to search for what they call good pasture. Is our future safe?
I think that young people on the continent, including some governments, are making significant progress in terms of good governance and how we take our countries. Rwanda is a clear example of the kind of governance that we have always required and the kind of transformation that we have always required on the continent. But fast forward, You can't be talking about the security and safety of a continent when we have so many wars on the continent, when South Sudan is destabilized, when Congo is not peaceful, when northern Nigeria has its own crisis, when the Sahel is in crisis. Of course, if poverty in majority of African countries continue to linger on, and young people do not see any hope in terms of the policy mechanisms of government to create safe spaces within the economic sector for them, of course, the dejection would exist. But I'm confident that the new African young person is beginning to realize that you go to Europe, there's nothing to do there. The real deal is Africa. You go to America, there's nothing to do there. So for those that have had an opportunity to travel to Europe and to the Americas, they know that it is easier to make life. It is easier to build a business on the African continent than going to Europe and the Americas. And I'm confident that once we begin to change our mindsets, we begin to hold our government and systems accountable, and we begin to advocate for the scaling up of policy, be it youth policy, economic policy, this continent will be a place to live, and I'm confident that we would achieve an integrated, prosperous Africa.
Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Thank you for having me.